What if I told you a single dog rewrote the laws of nature? In the frozen forests of New York, a retired sled dog named Max did something no scientist could explain. He became the mother to 2 lynx kittens, and against all odds, a cheetah cub rescued from the brink of death. How could a predator of the wild and a sprinter of the savannah survive under the care of a dog scarred by his own past? And years later, after the wild had reclaimed them, what brought them back to him? This is not fiction. This is the story that stunned the world. Snow pressed heavily against the windows of the Adirondack Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, a steady curtain of white that blurred the outlines of the forest beyond. Winter in upstate New York was unforgiving. Wind cutting through the pines, nights so silent that even the groan of shifting ice on the nearby lake felt like a voice from another world. Inside, though, warmth flickered in the glow of lamps and the steady hum of heaters where Dr. Evelyn Carter bent over her workbench. At 59, Evelyn bore the marks of a life spent in service to animals. Deep lines creased the corners of her eyes, but her gaze remained sharp, steady. Her auburn hair, now streaked liberally with silver, was tied back in a practical knot, and her hands, scarred from decades of field rescues and surgeries, moved with calm precision. She thought she had seen nearly everything during her years at the center: black bear cubs orphaned by car accidents, owls dazed by wind turbines, fawns trembling after hunters felled their mothers. But the knock on the side door that bitter February morning would change the rhythm of her life forever. 2 wildlife officers entered, their coats rimed with frost. In their arms lay a battered crate, lined with an emergency blanket. Evelyn's breath caught when she peered inside. Huddled together, eyes barely open against the cold, were 2 lynx kittens no more than 5 weeks old. Their ears were tufted with downy black tips, their coats still fuzzy with baby softness. The male's silver-grey pelt shimmered faintly in the lamplight, while the female's pale blue eyes, wide with confusion, blinked up at her with heartbreaking fragility. "Their mother was shot by poachers," one officer said grimly. "We found the den by chance. These 2 wouldn't have lasted the night." Evelyn's throat tightened. She lifted the kittens one at a time, cradling their frail bodies against her chest. Both were dangerously thin, ribs pressing through skin, paws icy from exposure. They let out the faintest mewling cries, weak but insistent, as though begging for a chance at life. Evelyn whispered softly, a reflex born of years of comforting the helpless. "You're safe now. You're safe." From the corner of the room came a low chuff. Max had risen from his mat. The 7-year-old Alaskan Malamute stood tall despite the faint limp in his hind leg, his thick coat bristling with curiosity. A long scar traced his left flank, a souvenir from his sledding days in Alaska, where he had once hauled through blizzards until an accident retired him for good. He had lived at the center since then, his strength redirected into companionship for the many orphans that passed through. Yet Max had always carried a contradiction within him. He disliked the barn cats that prowled around the property, grumbling at their antics, snapping the air if they ventured too close. Evelyn had learned to respect that boundary, which was why, as she turned to find Max's brown eyes locked intently on the trembling lynx kittens, she hesitated. Could this dog, so steadfast yet so particular, accept creatures that were not only cats, but wild cats, destined for a future far beyond human touch? Outside, the storm howled against the eaves, merciless and sharp. Inside, Evelyn felt something more delicate stirring, a fragile hope that perhaps, against every odd, this meeting between scarred dog and orphaned lynxes might become something neither she nor the forest had ever witnessed before. The kittens spent their first hours at the center, bundled in warmed blankets, their small bodies trembling as they fought against the chill that had nearly claimed them. Evelyn monitored their temperatures closely, syringe-fed them with careful drops of electrolyte solution, and rubbed their paws until faint sparks of life returned to their movements. Even with her decades of experience, she knew their survival was precarious. Newborn lynxes without a mother rarely thrived. The male, slightly larger, bore a striking silver coat streaked with faint spots that would fade as he grew. A small notch along one ear already set him apart, as if life had marked him from the start. His sister was smaller, more delicate, with pale blue eyes far too large for her tiny face. They blinked slowly, watery and unsure, but clung to the warmth of each other instinctively. Both were dehydrated and weak, their cries so soft they barely pierced the hum of the heaters. Evelyn watched them, torn between professional caution and the surge of tenderness that always caught her when she handled the very young. She knew bottle feeding alone might not be enough. The rhythm of a mother's heartbeat, the warmth of a body curled protectively around them, these things couldn't be replicated by heated pads or clinical efficiency. They needed more than food, they needed comfort. Her eyes drifted to Max. The Malamute lay on his mat nearby, head resting on his paws, but his gaze never left the box where the kittens slept. His ears twitched each time one of them stirred. Evelyn frowned. Max had never tolerated the center's domestic cats. He tolerated no feline nonsense, arching backs, sharp claws, mocking hisses. His disdain was legendary among the staff. And yet, when Evelyn bent to check the kittens again, Max rose quietly, padding across the room with surprising delicacy for his size. He stopped at her side, nose working furiously as he inhaled the new scents. His body was taut with concentration, but there was no trace of aggression. Instead, he leaned forward and let out a low whine, a sound Evelyn hadn't heard since his sled team days when he would call to his handler at rest stops. "Easy, boy," she murmured, keeping one hand on the kittens. Still, she couldn't ignore the softness in his eyes, the way his massive head tilted, as though he recognized something fragile and precious in their cries. She hesitated for long minutes. Logic warned her against it. These were wild lynxes, not puppies, but something deeper pushed her forward, the memory of other orphans who had only survived because someone had taken a risk. Slowly, she lifted the male kitten, silver fur warm against her palm, and held him toward Max. The dog's nostrils flared. For one tense second, Evelyn braced to pull the kitten back. Then Max leaned forward and touched his nose to the tiny body. A shudder ran through him, and he whimpered again, high, thin, almost maternal. Gently, almost reverently, he licked the kitten's head. The kitten stirred weakly, pressing into Max's fur, as though recognizing the comfort of another living being. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. When she lowered the female kitten beside her brother, Max curled his body protectively, lowering his chest to the ground until his flank pressed warm against their shivering forms, his great plume of a tail tucked carefully around them. The lynxes burrowed in instinctively, their cries softening into faint purrs of contentment. Evelyn sat back in stunned silence. For the rest of that night, Max scarcely moved. He lay curled around the box where Evelyn had transferred the kittens, occasionally shifting only to lick them clean, his rough tongue sweeping over their tiny ears and faces with astonishing gentleness. When Evelyn rose to prepare formula, Max followed her, nudging her arm insistently until she carried the bottles back. He watched as she fed them, sometimes pushing her hand gently with his muzzle, as though correcting her angle. By morning, the transformation was undeniable. The kittens had survived the night not because of the heaters or formula alone, but because of Max. They clung to his warmth, their fragile bodies steadied by the rhythm of his heartbeat. The staff arrived at dawn, stomping snow from their boots, and stopped in their tracks at the sight. A great malamute sprawled across the infirmary floor, 2 orphaned lynx kittens nestled safely in his thick coat. The room filled with hushed murmurs, disbelief mingled with awe. "Is he nursing them?" one whispered. "Not nursing," Evelyn corrected softly, "but mothering." And so it began, the most unlikely family the Adirondack Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had ever known. The weeks passed with a rhythm that felt almost natural, though nothing about it truly was. Max became the steady heart of the infirmary. The lynx kittens grew stronger, their eyes sharper each day, their steps more confident as they clambered over the thick ruff of his neck or tugged at his ears with needle-sharp claws. Evelyn documented everything in careful notes, photographs, and video clips. She knew they were witnessing a phenomenon few in her field had ever dared hope for. It was during this peaceful stretch in late March, when the snow was just beginning to soften into slush, that Evelyn received the call that would change everything again. The voice on the other end was strained, urgent. "Dr. Carter? It's Alan Brewer from the Green Valley Wildlife Park in Vermont. I need your help. Something we've never dealt with before." Evelyn stepped into her office, shutting the door against the playful squeaks of lynx kittens wrestling outside the infirmary. "What's happened?" Alan's words tumbled out. "We took in a cheetah cub, rescued from a private collector's basement, malnourished, underweight, maybe 3 weeks old. The mother rejected her after trauma, and the siblings didn't make it. She won't take a bottle. She's fading fast. I remembered you told me about Max, about the lynx kittens. Do you think—" Evelyn sank into her chair, staring at the frost-lined window. A cheetah. The thought alone was staggering. North America wasn't home to these animals. They belonged to the plains of Africa, not the snowy woods of New York or Vermont. The gulf between species felt wider, the risk far greater. Yet she remembered the sound of Max's whine the first time he had touched the lynx kittens, the gentleness of his care. She also remembered the desperation of the officers who had carried those lynxes into her life. She knew the tone in Alan's voice too well, the helplessness of watching life slip through your hands. "Bring her," Evelyn said finally. "Tonight, if you can." When the cub arrived, wrapped in a thick wool blanket and carried like a fragile secret through the storm, Evelyn's heart nearly broke. The cheetah was impossibly small, her ribs protruding, her tawny coat dull and patchy. Her head drooped, eyes half-closed and glassy. Each breath rattled as though the effort might be her last. She weighed barely more than a house cat. Evelyn and Alan's veterinarian worked quickly, administering fluids, warming her body, offering every variation of formula they could prepare. But the cub turned her face weakly away from the bottle, refusing even the smallest sip. Her strength was draining like water through a sieve. Max watched from his mat, the lynx kittens nestled against him, now 7 weeks old and thriving. He hadn't stirred during the commotion, but Evelyn noticed his ears twitch each time the cub coughed. When the cub let out a thin, pitiful cry, Max stood. Slowly, deliberately, he crossed the room. "Not yet, boy," Evelyn murmured, holding up a hand. But Max ignored her, his gaze fixed on the cub. He pressed his nose against Evelyn's arm, then nudged toward the tiny form sprawled on the table. Alan frowned. Is he asking to help? Evelyn hesitated. The lynxes had been one thing, closer in size, native to the landscape. But a cheetah cub? It felt impossible. Yet there was something in Max's eyes, a pleading urgency, as though he sensed what the humans could not provide. With a deep breath, Evelyn lifted the cub from the table and lowered her toward the waiting dog. Max lowered himself to the floor, curling protectively. The cub stirred faintly, drawn by his warmth, and with surprising clarity nosed toward his flank. It was instinct, ancient and undeniable. Within moments, the cub latched on. Weakly at first, then more steadily, drawing life from a dog separated by millions of years of evolution. The room fell into reverent silence, broken only by the soft sounds of the cub nursing. Alan wiped at his eyes. "I've worked with animals for 30 years, he whispered, "and I've never seen anything like this." Evelyn's chest tightened with awe and fear in equal measure. Against every barrier of nature, a starving cheetah cub had chosen an Alaskan Malamute as her mother. It was unprecedented, it was unexplainable, and it was happening right before her eyes. She looked at Max, who lay utterly still except for the gentle rise and fall of his chest. His gaze flicked up to hers, steady, unwavering. Evelyn realized in that moment that Max had already made his decision. He would raise this cheetah just as he had the lynx kittens, because they needed him and because his heart recognized no boundaries. In the days that followed, the infirmary became a place of quiet wonder. Against every reasonable expectation, Max now carried the weight of 3 fragile lives, a pair of wild lynx kittens and a cheetah cub that should never have been there at all. The staff moved softly through the halls, their conversations hushed, as if they were intruding on a miracle. The lynxes, having grown stronger under Max's steady warmth, treated the cheetah as a strange but unquestioned sibling. They clambered up his thick Malamute coat, pouncing on the great plume of his tail, or batting at the cheetah's oversized paws when she stumbled into their play. The cheetah, smaller and weaker than her foster siblings, would often topple in a clumsy heap, chirping her thin cries of frustration. But Max was always there, nose nudging her upright, body lowering to let her climb, his tongue sweeping across her face until her protests quieted into purr-like rumbles. Evelyn observed with awe how Max seemed to understand the differences between his charges. With the lynx kittens, now bold and curious, he allowed rougher play. He tolerated their needle-like claws digging into his ruff, growling softly only when they bit too hard. With the cheetah, though, he was gentler, more deliberate. He would lower his paw to block her when she grew too demanding at feeding time, but never forcefully. Only with the soft insistence of a seasoned parent who knows the limits of each child. As spring thawed, the snow and green began to creep back into the Adirondacks, Evelyn decided it was time to let the trio taste the outdoors. At first, it was only in the small enclosed clearing near the medical wing. Staff gathered at a respectful distance as Max stepped through the gate, the kittens perched precariously along his back, the cheetah toddling after him with a determination that belied her frail start. The lynxes darted forward almost immediately, instincts kicking in as they stalked beetles in the grass, their bodies low, paws silent despite their clumsy size. The cheetah, fascinated, attempted to mimic them, her gait unsteady, her balance off, yet her eyes blazing with the same intensity. She tumbled more often than not, but each time Max waited, watching, until she scrambled back to her paws. The sight of it, an Alaskan Malamute patiently leading 2 lynxes and a cheetah cub through the underbrush, spread quickly among the reserve's volunteers. Soon, it wasn't just staff, but visiting biologists, photographers, even a National Geographic team who came to witness what they quietly called the impossible pack. Cameras clicked, as Max corrected one of the lynx's crouches with a gentle tap of his paw, or as he positioned himself between the cheetah and a patch of brambles, steering her away from danger without a sound. But perhaps the most remarkable moments were those without fanfare. At dusk, when the clearing glowed gold and shadows stretched long across the pines, Max would settle at the edge of the enclosure. The lynx siblings would curl against his side, their tufted ears flicking at the night sounds. The cheetah, purring in her thin, broken rhythm, would burrow beneath his chin, her small body lost against his massive frame. There, beneath the fading light, predator and prey, dog and cat, wild and domestic, became something else entirely. A family. Evelyn documented tirelessly, but there were moments when she simply set her pen down and watched. She thought about the natural order she had studied her whole life, the boundaries evolution had carved so deeply. And yet, before her eyes, those lines blurred. Max wasn't supposed to be their mother, and yet he was. The lynxes weren't supposed to accept a cheetah, and yet they did. What could explain such devotion, such patience, such fierce and gentle love? Evelyn wasn't sure, but she knew this. In Max's steady heartbeat and the trust of 3 unlikely young, the forest itself seemed to whisper that survival wasn't always about bloodlines or species. Sometimes it was about choosing to belong together, no matter the odds. By midsummer, the trio had grown into a force of energy that filled every corner of the center. The lynx kittens, now sleek and sure-footed, had developed the piercing gaze of hunters. Their silver coats shimmered under the sun, and their paws, once trembling with weakness, now struck the ground with confidence. The cheetah, though younger and still less coordinated, had grown long-limbed and fast. Her spotted coat gleamed, her stride carried flashes of the speed she was destined for. Evelyn knew what this meant. As much as she wished time could stand still, nature had its own calendar. The lynx siblings had to begin their transition to the wild, and the cheetah could not remain here among the pines forever. Each species needed to learn the ways of its own kind if they were to survive. The decision weighed on her like a stone. She had seen Max curl around them at night, his great body the anchor of their small world. She had watched the lynxes return again and again to his side, even as their independence grew, and she had seen the cheetah press her nose into his fur, clinging to him as though he were the only certainty she had ever known. To separate them felt cruel, and yet she knew the greater cruelty would be to keep them bound to a life they could not lead. The process began gradually. The lynx kittens were moved to a larger pre-release enclosure deeper within the reserve, an expanse of forest where human presence was minimized. There they would learn to stalk, hunt, and claim their territory under the distant eye of hidden cameras. Evelyn made sure Max was present the first time they were carried away, though the Malamute's body trembled with unease. He pressed his nose against the crate as the gate closed behind them, whining low, his tail sagging. The lynxes, unsettled but instinctively curious, peered back only once before vanishing into the trees. Max lingered at the edge of that enclosure for hours, ears perked, waiting for them to return. When evening fell and they did not, he howled once, a deep, mournful note that carried through the forest like a question, with no answer. The cheetah's departure was even harder. She had become Max's shadow, following every step he took. To send her to Vermont, where other cheetahs waited at the sanctuary, meant taking away the one anchor she had ever known. Evelyn arranged for the transition to be gentle, visits first, then longer stays, until the cub grew comfortable in the company of her own kind. Yet each time she returned to Max's side, Her cries filled the hallways, and his low answering whines shook the walls. On the final day, when the transport crate was loaded into the truck, Max refused to move from the gate. He pressed his broad frame against the bars, tail tucked, eyes fixed on the cheetah inside. She reached her paw through the slats, claws snagging briefly in his fur, and let out a chirrup that cracked even the driver's professional composure. Max pawed at the ground, frantic but silent, as though he knew this goodbye was different. That night, for the first time in years, Max would not eat. He lay in the corner of the infirmary where their bed of blankets had once been, nose resting on the empty space. Evelyn sat beside him, her hand stroking his scarred flank, whispering words she wasn't sure he could understand, but needed to say anyway. They had to go. Max, you gave them what they needed to live. You were their mother, their family, and now it's time to let them be what they were born to be. Max closed his eyes, but his body shivered. For weeks afterward, he patrolled the edges of the reserve, nose lifted to every trace of scent, searching for the little ones he had raised. His grief was quiet but relentless, a shadow beneath his steady gait. Evelyn felt it too, a hollow ache that came not from failure, but from love, fulfilled and lost. In the stillness of those nights, as the wind whispered through the pines, it seemed the whole forest shared their mourning. The years passed in the steady rhythm of seasons, each one painting the Adirondacks in a new palette, green bursting through spring, gold and crimson blazing in autumn, and the deep hush of snow that winter always carried. Max aged with dignity through it all. His once boundless energy slowed, the limp in his hind leg more pronounced. Yet his spirit remained unbowed. He still greeted new orphans at the rehabilitation center, guiding them with patience. But there was a quietness to him now, a watchfulness, as if part of him forever listened for voices that were no longer there. Evelyn noticed how he sometimes lingered at the fence line of the deeper enclosures, nose pressed against the chain links, inhaling faint scents the wind carried from the forest. The lynxes had been released nearly 2 years earlier, and though cameras confirmed their survival, prowling with confidence, hunting with skill, they had not returned to the edges of the reserve. Evelyn doubted they ever would. Wildness was meant to pull them away, not back. Until one morning in March. The sun had just risen, laying a pale light across the frost-glittered ground, when Max's bark shattered the stillness. It wasn't the sharp warning call he gave to deer or coyotes, nor the mournful howl he sometimes let loose at night. This bark was different, rapid, joyous, trembling with excitement. Evelyn hurried outside, heart pounding. She found him at the far fence, body quivering, tail lashing in a way she hadn't seen since his younger years. On the other side of the mesh stood a lynx. Larger now, powerful and lean, his silver coat shone in the morning light. The distinctive notch in his ear left no doubt it was the male kitten, now grown into a magnificent adult. For a long moment, the two simply stared at one another. Evelyn held her breath, unwilling to break the spell. Then the lynx opened his mouth and made a sound Evelyn had only ever read about. A soft, trilling chirp. It was a call lynx mothers use with their young, intimate, and unmistakable. Yet here it was, directed not at his sister or a mate, but at the dog who had raised him. Max's entire body responded. His tail wagged so hard it thumped against the ground, his chest rumbling with high, eager whines. Then, astonishingly, he lowered himself into a play-bow, paws outstretched rear-high, the universal language of joy. The lynx stepped closer, pressing his face against the fence. Max mirrored him, muzzle to mesh. their breaths mingling through the narrow space. For minutes they stayed like that, silent, except for the soft sounds of recognition, the thump of a wagging tail, the faint purr-like trill of the lynx. Evelyn's eyes blurred with tears. Finally, as the sun climbed higher, the lynx stepped back. He turned toward the forest, his movements fluid and sure. But just before slipping into the trees, he looked back once, ears flicking, eyes lingering on Max as though committing him to memory once more. Then he was gone, swallowed by the wilderness. Max stayed by the fence long after, ears pricked, nose lifted to the air, heavy with his son's fading scent. He did not whine or howl, only stood quietly, his gaze locked on the place where the lynx had vanished. Evelyn knelt beside him, pressing her hand into his thick coat. "He remembered you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "After all this time, he still remembered." In that moment, Evelyn felt the years fall away, the fragile kittens, the impossible bond, the painful goodbyes. She realized what the wild had given back was not just proof of survival, but proof of something stronger, that love, once given, leaves an imprint even nature cannot erase. The phone call came a week after the lynx's return. Evelyn recognized the voice immediately. Alan Brewer from the Green Valley Wildlife Park in Vermont. His tone was tight, though layered with something softer, almost reverent. "Dr. Carter," he said, "I think it's time you and Max paid us a visit. She's different when she sees a German shepherd. I believe she remembers." Evelyn's chest tightened. The cheetah. She hadn't heard news of her in months, though Alan occasionally sent updates. Her weight gain, her gradual integration with 2 other young cheetahs at the sanctuary. Each report had been clinical, professional, never lingering on sentiment. But now Alan's voice trembled as though even he couldn't contain the awe of what he had witnessed. The drive south wound through thawing mountains and quiet villages, early spring teasing color back into the landscape. Max lay stretched across the back seat, his muzzle grayer now, but his eyes sharp with anticipation. It was as though he sensed where they were going, as though memory had been tugged awake by the lynx's visit. When they arrived, Alan led them through the sanctuary grounds to a wide enclosure bordered by high fencing. The air here was warmer, the ground bare of snow. Evelyn heard it before she saw her, a series of soft, chirruping calls rising in pitch and urgency. Then the cheetah appeared, sleek and golden, spots sharp against her coat, her body lean with the promise of speed. She was no longer the fragile cub who once fit beneath Max's chin. She was nearly 200 pounds of muscle and grace. And yet her voice was unmistakable, the same high-pitched calls of recognition she had used as a baby. Max stiffened for a heartbeat, ears pricked, then surged forward with a whine that broke into a cascade of barks, joyful, desperate, alive. Evelyn gripped his harness, but there was no aggression in him, only pure longing. The cheetah raced to the fence, not with the fluid silence of a predator, but with the bounding eagerness of a child running home. When she reached him, she pressed her entire body against the mesh, tail whipping side to side. Max buried his nose through the lynx, whining frantically, his tail wagging so hard his hips swayed. The cheetah lowered her head, grooming her paw, then turned and rubbed it slowly across the fence line. Evelyn froze, recognizing the gesture instantly. It was the same motion Max had taught her as a cub, when he licked his own paws and pressed them gently over hers. The staff standing nearby fell silent. A few wiped at their eyes. For nearly an hour, the two remained inseparable, pacing the fence together. Max would drop into a playbow, tail in the air, and the cheetah would chirp, pawing at the ground as though trying to mirror his posture. They remembered not just each other, but the games, the comfort, the language they had once shared when survival itself hung by a thread. Evelyn stood with Alan, her throat thick. "It's been 2 years," she murmured. 2 years and she still knows him. Alan nodded, his weathered face soft. "I've raised cheetahs my whole career. Bonds fade when instinct takes over, but this is something else." As the sun dipped low, casting the enclosure in amber light, Evelyn knew they would have to leave soon. She called to Max gently, tugging at his harness. He resisted at first, pressing harder against the fence as the cheetah chirped desperately, pacing alongside him. Finally, with one last whine, he turned away. The cheetah followed as far as she could, her slender body shadowing the vehicle's path until the road curved out of sight. Evelyn glanced in the rearview mirror and caught the image of her pressed against the fence, head lifted, eyes locked on the dog, disappearing from view. Max lay down with a sigh, his body trembling with exhaustion, but his eyes glowed with something Evelyn hadn't seen in years: fulfillment. The lynx had remembered, and now the cheetah had too. Love had crossed the wild twice, and twice it had come back. In the months after the reunions, Max seemed to carry himself with a quiet dignity, as if a chapter of his life had come full circle. He was older now, his once powerful frame beginning to stoop, his muzzle frosted almost entirely with white, but his eyes retained their steady warmth. Around the center, he still offered comfort to new orphans, a trembling fawn curled against his side, a red-tailed hawk chick blinking from the safety of a box, while Max lay guard nearby. The staff often said there was a gentleness in him now that hadn't been there before, as though his heart had been both stretched and steadied by what he had done. 4 years passed this way. Max aged gracefully, though the limp in his hind legs slowed him more and his naps grew longer. Evelyn cherished each day with him, knowing time was slipping. She often caught him staring toward the woods where the lynxes had once vanished, or perking up when visitors mentioned the cheetah. It was as though part of him still listened for them, carrying their memory like a secret flame. One cold morning in early winter, Max did not rise from his bed. He lay curled in the blankets of the infirmary, breathing softly, his body at peace. Evelyn knelt beside him, stroking his thick coat as tears blurred her vision. She whispered words of thanks for his years of loyalty, for the lives he had saved, for the love that had crossed every boundary through him. He slipped away quietly, without struggle, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed the entire center held its breath. That night, something remarkable happened. The motion cameras in the reserve captured 2 lynxes, fully grown and wild, lingering near the very fence line where Max had once greeted them. They sat together, tails wrapped around their paws, and lifted their heads to call into the night. Their voices carried, eerie and beautiful, as though they were mourning. And in Vermont, Alan reported that the cheetah paced her enclosure until dawn, vocalizing in a restless pattern she had not made in years. Evelyn scattered Max's ashes in 2 places, beneath the Adirondack pines where he had walked with the lynxes, and at the sanctuary where the cheetah pressed against the fence, waiting for him still. The wind carried the ashes high, mingling them with the wild places he had given his heart to. Spring returned to the Adirondacks, softening the edges of winter and covering the forest floor with new life. It was during that season of renewal that Evelyn and the staff unveiled what they had quietly worked on for months: a memorial garden dedicated to Max. Nestled in a grove where sunlight filtered through tall maples, it became a place of stillness, a sanctuary within the sanctuary. At its center, stood a bronze statue. The sculptor had captured Max in a moment of quiet guardianship, his massive frame lying protectively around two lynx kittens while a cheetah cub nestled against his chest. The detail was exquisite, from the scar along his flank to the softness in his eyes. Visitors often paused in silence before it, their expressions softening as though they too felt the weight of the story cast in metal. Beneath the statue, house engraved into a smooth granite stone, were the words, "A heart wide enough for the wild." Evelyn had chosen them herself, knowing nothing else could summarize what Max had given. People came from all over. Volunteers who had once bottle-fed the lynxes, children who had followed the news articles, strangers who had only heard whispers of a dog who raised wild cats. They left flowers, smooth stones, and handwritten notes tucked carefully beneath the statue's paws. Some visitors wept openly, others simply stood in reverent silence. Often they asked Evelyn the same question. Was it really true? Did a sled dog truly raise lynxes and a cheetah? And did they really remember him years later? Evelyn never argued, never lectured. She would only smile and point toward the trees. "Go quietly," she would say, "and you might see for yourself." For some times, when the forest grew still, a silver-coated lynx with a notched ear was spotted at the edge of the garden, sitting tall and unafraid. His presence needed no explanation. The garden became a place of reflection, not just for Max's story, but for the larger truth it carried. That family can be forged in the most unlikely places, and love leaves echoes that never fade. In the hush of that woodland clearing, where a bronze dog kept eternal watch, people found not only memory, but hope. Years later, when Evelyn spoke to new interns at the rehabilitation center, she often ended with Max's story. She told it not as a legend, but as a simple truth, that once a retired sled dog with a scar on his side opened his heart wide enough to shelter three creatures who should never have shared the same family. She would pause, letting the silence linger, then remind them that science explains much, but not everything. Instinct could not account for the way Max had chosen to nurture, nor could biology explain why wild lynxes and a cheetah still remembered him after years apart. What endured was not formula or protocol, but love, stubborn, unwavering, and beyond boundaries. For Evelyn, that was the lesson Max left behind. Family was not limited to bloodlines or species. It was created in the moments of care, in the nights spent warming fragile bodies, in the gentle correction of a paw laid across a reckless kitten's back. It was in the way bonds endured even when life pulled them apart. Visitors who came to the memorial often asked why his story mattered so much. Evelyn always answered the same, because it proves love is the strongest force in nature. It bridges every divide, it heals wounds no medicine can touch, and it leaves a legacy that even the wild will honor. Some nights, when the forest was especially quiet, Evelyn swore she could still hear it, the echo of a lynx's chirp in the distance, or the faintest cheetah chirrup carried on the wind. She would smile, knowing it was not imagination but memory, a reminder that Max's gift was not only to the animals he saved, but to every heart willing to believe that love truly knows no limits.